Today, we're doing something that's probably going to upset a few people, something controversial, something that might get me kicked out of a couple of brewing forums. We're using bread yeast. Yeah, that bread yeast. Welcome back to Brewing with the Captain, where we question authority, especially when that authority is a guy online with a hydrometer and a superiority complex. Today, we're talking about one of the most unfairly demonized ingredients in brewing, bread yeast. Now, before the comment section explodes, no, I'm not saying it's the best yeast. No, I'm not saying replace everything with it. What I am saying is that it's been treated like the instant coffee of brewing, when in reality, it's more like a cheap whiskey. Rough? Sometimes. Undrinkable? Not even close. Let's get one thing straight right away. Bread yeast will produce alcohol, and it'll do it just fine. Typically, you're looking at around 8 to 12% ABV, although purely for scientific reasons, I may or may not have pushed it over 20% without a lot of care. Was it good? That's not the point. Here's a weird idea that seems to upset people. Yeast doesn't know what it's making. There is no bread in bread yeast. There is no wine in wine yeast. There is no stout in stout yeast. The yeast isn't sitting there going, "Ah yes, today I shall craft a delicate Pinot Noir." It's just trying to survive, eat sugar, and accidentally get everything drunk. But I think a big part of the misunderstanding comes from the name. Bread yeast. People hear that and assume it's somehow fundamentally different, like it's only designed to make bread, and gets confused if you give it sugar water. But yeast doesn't think like that. Before modern yeast labs, before fancy strain numbers, people used wild yeast, bread cultures, leftover sludge from previous brews. And somehow, miraculously, civilization didn't collapse. Specialized brewing yeast is a modern luxury, not a requirement. Also, fun fact, a lot of modern bread yeast strains were originally developed from rum yeasts. So if anything, bread yeast has more pirate energy than most brewing yeasts. Now let's deal with the big scary myth that always comes up. Bread yeast makes dangerous alcohol. Short answer, no, it doesn't. Longer answer, all yeast produces ethanol and a range of minor byproducts. That's just fermentation. Methanol gets brought up a lot, but that's mainly linked to pectin in fruit, not the type of yeast you're using. So switching from a brewing yeast to bread yeast doesn't suddenly turn your brew into poison. The yeast doesn't know it's meant to make a baguette. It's just trying to survive and get drunk. Now this ties into something else I think is worth understanding. Turbo yeast. Because people often compare bread yeast to turbo yeast, like they're just two different yeasts. But turbo yeast isn't just yeast. Sounds impressive, right? Like it should come with a spoiler and racing stripes. But here's the reality. It's not just yeast. It's yeast, nutrients, buffers, sometimes clearing agents. You're not buying yeast. You're buying a fermentation system in a packet. Now compare that to this. Bread yeast plus tomato paste, maybe lemon juice, plus a bit of Epsom salt, Vegemite or boiled yeast. Congratulations, you've just built a DIY turbo system. Budget brewing, Captain approved. Now where things do start to matter more is flavor. Different yeasts produce different esters, different aromas, different overall character. Bread yeast can sometimes give you slightly funkier, more yeasty notes, and depending on what you're making, that can either be a problem or exactly what you want. If you're trying to make something really clean and crisp, like a champagne-style brew, it might not be ideal. But if you're making something like rum, those slightly funky characteristics can actually be really desirable. So it's not that it's worse. It's just different. And when people talk about bread yeast making brews that are a bit cloudier, a bit rougher, a bit more home brew, kind of find that interesting. Because if you look at what a lot of modern craft breweries are doing, that's almost the point. Over the last couple of decades, there's been this huge shift towards small batch, character-driven brews that aren't perfectly polished. So what used to be seen as flaws are now sometimes features. And then there's just the practical side of things. Not everyone has access to specialty yeast. Depending on where you are, you might not be able to walk into a shop and grab a champagne yeast or a specific strain. But bread yeast, that's everywhere. It's cheap, it's easy to find, and if you bake at home, there's a good chance you already have it sitting in your fridge. So with all that said, why not just use bread yeast all the time? And this is where the nuance comes in. Different yeasts are developed to do different things. Some handle higher alcohol levels, some work better at lower temperatures, some are better in more acidic environments. Some are selected specifically for the flavors they produce. Bread yeast is more of a generalist. It'll do the job, but it's not specialized. And that's why you see those rough ranges. Ale yeast sitting around 10 to 14%, wine yeast going higher, turbo yeast pushing even further, and bread yeast generally sitting a bit lower, though it can surprise you if you push it. There are a couple of genuine downsides, though. One of the main ones is that it doesn't flocculate as well, which just means it doesn't settle out as cleanly, so your brew can end up a bit hazy, maybe with a bit more yeast character. But even that's not a huge issue. Cold crash it, stick it somewhere cold for a few days, and it'll clear up a lot. The other thing people don't always think about is consistency. Brewing yeasts are lab-controlled and designed to behave predictably. Bread yeast is designed to make dough rise quickly and reliably. So when you use it for brewing, you can get a bit more variation from batch to batch. Sometimes that's a downside. Sometimes that's part of the fun. If you are going to use it, there are a few simple things that make a big difference. Temperature control is a big one. If it gets too hot, you're more likely to get off flavors. Nutrients can help a lot too, especially if you're working with something like a sugar wash that doesn't naturally have much in it. And like anything, more isn't always better. So don't just dump in a huge amount of yeast and hope for the best. And yeah, cold crashing at the end really helps clean things up. Where bread yeast really shines is when you're experimenting, when you want something quick, cheap, accessible, when the shops are closed and you just want to get something going, or when you're making simpler brews like sugar washes or basic ciders. It's not a last resort, it's just another option. At the end of the day, brewing is part science, part tradition, and a big part experimentation. And the idea that there's only one correct yeast for any given drink, that often says more about marketing than it does about reality. Anyway, curious what you think. Would you like to see me do a proper side-by-side test? Same recipe, different yeasts. Bread yeast, a neutral brewing yeast, maybe a turbo yeast just for contrast? If that sounds interesting, let me know in the comments. And if not, tell me what you do want to see. Also, quick question for you. This video is written and produced by me, but I switched over to a text-to-voice narrator because some people found my accent a bit hard to understand. Now I'm getting the opposite feedback, that people don't like the artificial voice. So, what do you prefer? The generated voice?
Or this, which is my natural voice. And I don't know, some people don't mind it, some people find the accent hard to understand.
Let me know. All right, until next time, stay curious, keep experimenting, and don't let anyone tell you your yeast is wrong.